Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I'm joined by my good friend, Dr. Philip Chase. Philip, hello.
Hello, AP. It's great to be here. As always, it's just a pleasure. I always love seeing your smiling face.
And today, Philip, what are we doing today, children? What is the thing that we are going to discuss, which has me wrapped up in so much glee? You
Yeah, me to
you
start
did
on
a
that?
great video recently on
Yeah,
One of Salman Rushdie's essays. That it's just
yeah.
a new collection of essays that's been published, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a fairly recent publication. And the essay that I read was called Wonder Tales. And I think a version of it appeared in the New York Times. I don't know for sure because I did not read the article in the New York Times. I'm not subscribed to it. And when I tried to click on the link, it said I had to subscribe. So I didn't. But I think it's the one. I saw a quote or two and it made me think, okay, it's maybe a version of it if it's not the whole thing. But yeah,
Drat those paywalls.
I know. Isn't it awful? Jeez.
Um, but the thing was, I watched your video on this because I remember was either a month ago or a couple of months ago, I had seen the buzz around this particular essay, and I
Yeah.
basically had a slightly sarcastic tweet saying, "Oh look, Salman Rushdie has discovered the genre of fantasy."
AP, were you being sarcastic in that tweet?
Maybe a bit snarky, maybe not full on sarcasm.
Okay.
Because while I understand, and you give, I linked to your discussion of it because you give quite a decent synopsis of Rushdie's argument,
Yeah.
and he is obviously an excellent author, an excellent writer, very well respected, award winning,
Yeah.
very intelligent person,
Yeah.
and basically, I think his argument is idiotic. Um,
Way to set that up. Okay.
but
Yeah.
but why don't you lay out, in essence, for people who haven't seen your video yet, what
Yeah.
Rushdie's argument was?
Sure. Yeah. So essentially, the essay was primarily an apology for fantasy or the fantastic, not fantasy, because I want to get this confused, but an apology for the fantastic in literature and saying that one can convey important truths through the fantastic, and that it is every bit as respectable as realism, unless it's fantasy, unless it's genre fiction, apparently, because he made it very clear in the essay as well, although this wasn't the main point, I think, of his essay, but he really seemed to want to differentiate his kind of writing, which sometimes people refer to as magic realism or magical realism. And I know there are differences. We could get into a whole discussion of what that is, but he wants to differentiate what he's doing using the fantastic from what you get the sense that there's a bit of looking down here of mere genre fiction writers do, and that somehow what he's doing is high and serious, but what genre fiction writers do is he was dismissive. Let's put it that way. And he mentioned a couple real punching bags, I think it's fair to say, in Twilight and the Hunger Games. I have not read those, so I don't have an opinion. I'd be curious to hear your take, though, because I know you've taught
Well,
Twilight class before, right? I mean, I know you weren't doing it as an example of the greatest literature or something like that, but
and one of the reasons why I think this is an absolutely asinine argument
yeah,
is not that I disagree that fantasy is not as important as real literature. Fantasy is literature. Science fiction is literature. Horror is literature. You know how I know this? Because it's called fantasy literature, science fiction literature, horror literature. It is
yeah,
literally the word that follows the descriptor.
yeah,
Genre, as we all know, there are different ways you can construct genre. And actually, China Medieval has a brilliant whole takedown of genre and subgenreification. Absolutely fantastic, and people should try and find that one. But genre is just a way of grouping things together like as like. So when we were initially taught English literature, we talked about these genres of prose, drama, and poetry. And you go,
Right.
yeah, they're genres. It is a group. That's how we do it. So what do we talk about when we talk about fantasy? We're talking about the inclusion of the fantastic, science fiction. Oh, there's a certain level of tropes or styles or things that, and we group those together as science fiction. Horror.
Right.
Oh, it's doing these things, and we group that together as that is horror. One of an odd one out in all of this would be young adult, because that is not actually looking at the book, it's looking at the intended audience.
Right.
And this is where we get into a different way of thinking about genre, which is a marketing category, something that publishers and booksellers use to go, if you're looking for a book and you like X, here's a book that's like X or is intended for the same audience as X. So it's a way to facilitate the consumption of narrative. That's absolutely fine. But the idea that any sort of fiction is more real than other sorts of fiction. Spoiler alert, it's fiction. It's made up. It's not real. None of it is real. It is fiction. It is right there. Science fiction, fantasy fiction.
Yeah.
None of it is real. If you're defining, oh, this literature is much more important because it is more real. Ooh, what set of lies in that book do you think are less lie-y than the set of lies in that book?
Oh, I like that. I'm going to use that, less lie-y. Yeah.
It is absolutely ludicrous, stupid, and asinine. Now, I will carry on this rant in a minute because there are multiple parts to this rant, because I have been involved in having this argument for the better part of 20 years.
Yeah. I don't know, AP, I think you should tell us how you really feel.
But let's start with a very simple, very easy way to illustrate why this sort of exceptionalism is absolutely dumb. And then we'll talk about why this exceptionalism is being wheeled out, and then we can talk about other aspects of it.
Yeah, good. That sounds good, because there's a history here we have to talk about. Yeah.
So let's take something that we can say part of the English literary canon, universally admired. This is great literature. The plays of William Shakespeare. Well, apart from A Midsummer Night's Dream, because that has a whole load of fantasy elements in it, so clearly that one's shit.
Oh, and The Tempest.
And The Tempest. Let's get rid of that one as well, because that's clearly shit. Oh, and Hamlet. Sorry, there's a ghost in Hamlet. That's a supernatural element. It's an element of the fantastic.
That's horror.
That means it's less realistic. That one has to go as well, because it's crap.
Macbeth has witches.
Oh, sorry, that's gone as well.
Darn it.
Do you see how bloody stupid that argument is? Why is Macbeth less good because it has the witches in it?
Yeah.
Why is Hamlet less good because there's a bloody ghost in it?
Yeah. Well, the Shakespeare example is an important one, and it's one that quite a few of my viewers commented on as well. And I think it's important because Shakespeare didn't think of himself as somehow writing high literature that is somehow differentiated by or from this mere genre fiction schlock that other people do. In fact, Shakespeare was probably interested in selling tickets to his movie theater primarily. He was an entertainer. And I think he would be actually a little bit shocked at how people regard him today as this icon, this inaccessible genius, and all of that. I think it's actually a disservice to his plays in a way, because you create this aura of incomprehensibility almost. And I think that's a turnoff for a lot of people who actually would enjoy his plays if they understood how much fun they are, how entertaining they are, how escapist they are, if I can use that word.
Yeah, but let's take another literary great from the established literary canon, Charles Dickens, because clearly Oliver Twist is a great book. Bleak House is a great book. A Christmas Carol, shit book because it has ghosts in it.
Oh yeah, those ghosts. Forget it.
And you go, What idiot thinks that that is a level of argument that you can wheel out in any sort of way to legitimize your position? You go, clearly, you've had some sort of brain embolism, because the idea that the inclusion of a narrative element is the thing that is going to change everything and reduce its efficacy, reduce the quality of the literature. That's just bloody stupid. Because let's think about it. I had mentioned that everything is fiction. It is all fiction. And you go, oh, but Julie, let's look at one of the sort of the history plays. Or actually, no, let's look at one of the great romances of all time by Shakespeare. Romeo and Juliet. In fair Verona shall we lay our scene, whatever the opening bloody line is. Okay, so you show me, take me to where that is set. Does that exist? No, is it a fictional place? Right. Shakespeare picked the name, never been there, and that's where he said it because it suited the setting. Was it a real place? Well, it's named after a real place, but what's in the play has nothing to do with the real place. It is a fictional setting. There is no difference from between, in terms of its realism, the Verona of Romeo and Juliet and Gondor in Tolkien. They are both equally unreal. They are both equally made up. They are both equally the conjurings of the insane machinations inside the artist's brain.
Yeah. So, but if I'm understanding Rushdie specifically, and there have been many different versions of this argument, but if I'm understanding him specifically, he says that the fantastic in literature can be a wonderful thing, and it's a great thing. He does it himself in his books. At least I've read Midnight's Children. I haven't read the rest of his books. I'd like to because he's a great author. But for some reason, he thinks it's great literature if a certain set of people do it, but not, and this puzzles me, not when other people do it. And the same inspirations are behind the fantasy, genre authors that are behind the magical realism authors in many cases. So it puzzles me. Why is it that when some people do it, it's great literature, it's a brilliant incorporation of the fantastic to convey important truths, but when other people do it, it's schlock, it's genre fiction. So that's what puzzles me, because he's not against fantasy or the fantastic in literature, but for some reason it's elevated on the one hand, or it's at least equal with realism. that's a misnomer, of course, as you know. But why is it not? I mean, so what way I think.
Do you want to know the answer to that? It's our fault, academics. We are responsible for this stupidity being perpetuated again and again and again. So let's talk about this element of exceptionalism before we get into the fact that you and I are actually to blame for this, because it's always nice to throw other people under the bus first. Margaret Atwood, a brilliant Canadian award-winning science fiction author, had that very infamous essay and the infamous sort of position that she didn't write science fiction because science fiction was all spaceships and aliens, and she wrote something that was extrapolated from the real world and was talking about real things. Salman Rushdie, I write magic realism. I don't write fantasy. Margaret Atwood, I write speculative fiction. I don't write science fiction. And all of this is a way to carve out. Yes, they buy into the premise that realism and that style, that particular genre, literary fiction, it is a genre itself, it is a style of writing itself, that is proper literature. And although they are doing something that is in the fantastic realm, it is speculative fiction, it is science fiction, it is fantasy, it is these things. Those things are commercial genres, and they want to be recognized for their literature. So they carve out a much more erudite, academic sounding term, speculative fiction. Oh, magic realism, because, fantasy. Oh, well, that's just some guy with a sword on the back of a dragon saving a woman who's dressed in a chainmail bikini. Oh, science fiction. Oh, that's just lasers and ray guns on spaceships and aliens blowing up.
Right.
And you go, number one, that's because these people who are brilliant, intelligent, articulate, talented authors are trying to gain a level of legitimacy against a perceived genre ghetto.
Yes.
And let's face it, the history of some science fiction and the history of some fantasy is right down there in the schlocky pulps and the
Yeah.
awful stories and the poorly written stories and things that were churned out uh, to sell copies as populist fiction, you know, exactly the way that Charles Dickens did. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean Dickens. No, although Dickens did that, like he was a talented author, and when he did it for popularity and to churn things out in magazines, that was an entirely different proposition to how people did it for science fiction and fantasy.
I'm detecting a little bit of sarcasm there again, AP. So
But
yeah, I mean that's all very important, and the fact is, I want to talk maybe later about how this is not just condescending toward what a lot of people enjoy reading, but it's also bad for what these people are calling literature. And the humanities are in big trouble. And again, I think we are to blame, academics, in a big way, because of the barriers we've set up. And because we want to divide what's entertaining and what's escapist from what's elevating and what's thematic and all of this. So the truth is, there's no separation. Storytelling is storytelling. Any story has the capacity to both entertain and to enlighten. And there will be varying degrees of this, depending on the talent but also the desire of the author. So for an author to pretend that what he's doing is a different species altogether from what these people over here are doing, I think is wrong. And it's not helpful it's patronizing and condescending on the one hand, but it's also, I think in the long term, really harmful for the very works of literature that we are pretending to champion here. But should we go back into the history of this? I think because maybe not everyone is aware of the late 19th century, early 20th century beginnings of academic departments and academia and these categories that we're talking about. They haven't been around all that long, have they?
No. And on the one hand, yes, I think a lot of this can be laid at the door of academics, institutions.
Right.
Some of it is absolutely understandable. How we got to this position. You can follow along and go, well, you know, if I'd been there at the time, I'd have done exactly the same thing. But it has led to this issue. So the first thing that we have to understand is English literature was not always taught at all these different universities. English literature is a relatively new subject.
Yep.
It doesn't have the same long storied history. The classics were taught Oxford and Cambridge and I would assume Harvard, and the classics were taught. They read the Greek epics. They read the histories, the ancient Greek and Latin, all of those things. But the study of vernacular English, the bare prose of the English language,
right,
that was a relatively new study. And in order to gain, I think, some element of legitimacy,
right,
there was an attempt to create, because you can't study everything. You try to draw a line in the sand to go, you know, there obviously are good stories and ones that are not quite as good. You know, we might still love them, but are they well written? Are they going to be interesting to study? Do they do something worth studying?
right.
And when you are trying to teach literature to undergraduates, you cannot teach all books ever written. You have to make a selection. So how do you make a selection? You go, well, what are important books? What are things that have shaped literature? What are things that resonate? And let's face it, we're also going to pick things that we like, because we hate teaching things that we don't like. So if you've wound up teaching at a university and you've grown up on certain books and you like certain books, there is going to be a leaning toward creating the literary canon out of the books that you like. And we have this formation of these great works. Why is Shakespeare continually taught? Is it he was the greatest playwright? Well, Marlowe was more respected at the time than Shakespeare was.
Yeah.
So why is this always this focus on Shakespeare and not on Kit Marlowe? Webster, like Jacobean tragedy. Why aren't we looking more at Webster? In fact, we have more intact information about Webster's plays than we do the bad quartos and the folios and the cobbled together remnants of half-remembered snippets of Shakespeare that have been cobbled together to create the definitive edition of. There is no first edition. There is no definitive edition of the vast majority of Shakespeare stuff because it wasn't printed. It wasn't written down at the time.
Yeah. Let's talk for a moment about a word that you used that's very important and I think problematic, and that is canon.
Yeah.
And it is problematic because who's making the decisions about which works are part of the canon? And we could get into a whole discussion about the privileging of and the confirmation of certain biases that have been part of our society due to racism, sexism, and other things. So there's certainly a lot of these biases went into the selection of what is considered worthy of study, what is in the canon. And this is a relatively recent thing, the idea that some things are in and some things are not, this idea of the canon. And it is fraught with all kinds of problems. That is something that I think is worth mentioning in the context of this discussion. We don't want to get lost in that right now, but just we're aware that this is a problematic thing, the canon.
Yeah, but particularly if you think when we were at school and you were told, right, you have to read, or at university, you have to read Shakespeare. So you read Shakespeare and you go off to become a lecturer and you go, right, well, now I have to teach Shakespeare. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy because he was Shakespearean plays are taught. They then continue to be taught. Because George Eliot is taught, because Charlotte Bronte is taught. They're all these great works. They have survived. They are continually reprinted.
Right.
And but what about the other books that have survived? Why aren't we teaching those? Oh, well, but these are good. But you haven't read the other ones. Right. And there is something of a self-fulfilling prophecy about the stuff our teachers were taught is what they taught our teachers, and our teachers taught us, and then we teach other people. It is passed down generation upon generation. And that is one of the ways that certain texts acquire legitimacy and acquire this canonical status.
Yes. And I don't think, look, there are plenty of things that you could critique about Shakespeare's plays. They are not some perfect thing. There are plenty of things you could say. But they have acquired such an aura that it's almost as if they're worshipped, and which is, again, part of the establishing this canon, legitimizing the profession. All of that is part of the whole history of what is considered great literature, and the rest is outside of this circle of perfection, if you will. So it's a bit like I was talking with Joanna not long ago, and this sort of topic came up. It was after I had posted the video, and she brought in a musical analogy. And coincidentally, my wife also talked about this in terms of, if you compare like what happened in the history of jazz, right? Jazz at first was not regarded as serious, high music. It was not worthy of, it was regarded as low and it was considered almost dangerous and all of this and that. So of course, there's a lot of racial motivations behind these assessments as well. But what's interesting is there at some point came a recognition of the genius underlying this music, and it made its way.
Quick question. Was that recognition when white people started doing it?
Well, there you go. So who makes these decisions? This is part of the whole thing. Who's empowered to make these decisions about what is canon, what is considered to be great in terms of the music, in terms of the literature? So this is the very fraught thing. And the idea that I think we professionals, where this is where our guilt lies, is in legitimizing our professions, and is in saying, hey, we are the arbiters, we are the gatekeepers, and we say these are the great works. And we pretend that there is very little relationship between these great works and whatever doesn't make it in, right? And our biases are confirmed the whole time. It's just like a circle of bias confirmation. These are great works of literature because we say they are, and so on and so forth. So this is a big part of, I think, unfortunately, I don't know Salman Rushdie's personal feelings on all this stuff that we've been talking about, but what he said about genre fiction in that essay reminds me a lot about this whole attempt to assert a kind of superiority that literature has over the rest. And I think it's unfortunate and it's sad in a way, because they aren't different species, and there is a whole array of a whole spectrum, as I put it in my video, of stories, and they all perform these functions. And look, Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie is very entertaining. It has sex in it. It has violence in it. It has crude humor. It has all this stuff. So does Shakespeare, by the way. Shakespeare's plays are entertaining because they have violence and sex and crude humor. And these are things that we associate with our noses pointing down with genre fiction. But, I think a great story is one that both entertains and can give us some, clue about our place in the universe. So, and there's lots of that. Let's not pretend. There's a ton of that in fantasy. I named a whole bunch of names when I was in my video of writers I would put right alongside Rushdie as wonderful writers who have given us works of literature that are absolutely, A, yes, entertaining, but B, they are really deep and full of themes and make me ponder and appreciate my world and so much else. And that's what great literature is supposed to do. And yes, there are a lot of authors in fantasy who do that.
And one of the other things to remember is what is viewed as important in literature tends to go through cycles. We had the rise if we think back to 18th, 19th century texts, and narrative was all important. The plot was all important. The narrative events that drove everything. Psychological realism, not a thing. And then we get to the sort of, as more authors start trying to write more realistic characters, this new innovation coming in, this is brilliant. This is so much better. Because when you contrast the Three Musketeers, where you have D'Artagnan going, being told his whole life, you must respect the king, you must respect Cardinal Richelieu, you must respect Monsieur de Treville. They're the three men he has been told his entire life that he must respect. The top three men in the country. That's the order. He leaves the farm, arrives in Paris, and someone says, yeah, but the cardinal's evil. Aha, I will fight the cardinal. It's a complete volte-face. He turns around and goes immediately against the beliefs he has held his entire life on the words of a stranger. And in today's fiction, you'd go, it's not really psychologically real now, is it? That's just not believable. And you're right, because we've had this movement towards psychologically real characters, that we have this idea of believability, and that characters must act in a way that is more true to them, because we're trying to create these human characters to explore the human condition. You go, that's absolutely fine. That's something that gets brought in. And because of that, narrative and plot and story and those elements take a back seat to character. Think of the number of people who, when they're talking about, they will say, I'm a character reader, as if in some way that makes them any different to any other reader of fiction. You're reading fiction that has characters in it. Oh no, but I read for the characters. Well, it's very hard to read narrative without any characters. There is
Yeah.
some, but but people use this as a way of creating a distinction, an exception, making
Right.
themselves exceptional in exactly the same way that Atwood talks about speculative fiction being different to science fiction,
Right.
or Rushdie in trying to set magic realism apart from fantasy. And why
Right.
do we do this? Because we've bought into the argument. We've accepted the premise of the argument that realism is good and anything that isn't realistic is bad. And you go, that is quite simply not true.
Right.
Because, well, this would be what I would argue. When you create these exceptional little caveats to make yourself, well, although I like that thing, it's because of this. What you're doing is you're agreeing with the other side, and instead
Yeah.
of defending your position to go, you guys are wrong, you're actually saying, you guys are right, but I'm slightly different. My argument, the reason I dislike Rushdie's argument is
Right.
this is not about realism versus fantasy. That
Right.
is an arbitrary distinction that is absolutely meaningless.
Right.
What
And I
we are
think he
talking,
agrees with you. He agrees with you thus far. Yeah.
but
Right.
he doesn't, because if
Hmm.
if he agreed with my position, he would never say I write magic realism, which is different to fantasy,
Uh-huh.
because then he's saying yes, fantasy is bad, but I'm doing something that's different to fantasy, even
I
though it
see what you mean.
involves things that are unreal, things
Yeah.
that are strange, things that are supernatural, things that don't make sense in the real world, things that are 180 degrees away from the direction of what realism is. You go,
Well,
that's fantasy.
one of my commenters called that mental gymnastics, his position there. And I had to agree with that. Yeah.
And it's because I fundamentally disagree with the position that
Right.
realism is the thing that makes literature good. Literature is good when, and I have my own bias. I like it to be well written. I don't like badly written prose. That's my own personal thing. But
Right.
as I have said this so many times now, it is almost a refrain. When you read, the text remains static. You read it, and in your brain, you create meaning. The meaning isn't on the page. The meaning is created in your brain. And so we can take something like The Hunger Games, which I think is absolute trash. I really do not like The Hunger Games. I don't enjoy the prose. I don't enjoy the story. I don't enjoy the characters. You know
You've
what?
read it, obviously. Yeah.
But why not? You go, because I'm not the bloody intended audience, now am I? I'm not, this book is not aimed at me. It's not trying to push the psychological buttons that work on me. It's trying to push different psychological buttons. You go,
Yeah.
do other readers love those books? Yes. Would I make fun of them for liking those books? No, because they're bloody reading a book, and that book speaks to them. Now,
Right.
would I like them to read those books and then go and read more books and read more books and perhaps end up with a taste closer to mine? Yes, because then I could talk to them about the books that I like.
Right.
But I don't denigrate those novels when they speak to a reader.
Yeah.
And those novels, in my opinion, and admittedly it's my opinion, would not be improved if they were set on a small island off Japan, or were set on a small island in the Atlantic somewhere. If you just moved the story to an island, like Battle Royale was set like that. You go, is Battle Royale better than the Hunger Games because it's more realistic and not set in a dystopian YA nonsensical future where the world building makes no sense, the characters are two-dimensional? No, well, maybe it would be better, but not because the setting was more real, not because the elements were more real, because Battle Royale is just as dystopian, just as separated from reality, because the essence of the story is about the trials of the character. The setting, that aspect of it is not going to change any of that.
Right.
When we talk about Twilight, and I'm perfectly candid, I read them because my students liked them. I used them to teach. Oh, but you were in an English literature department, AP. How could you use them to teach? Because they were an incredibly useful tool to reach my students. We
Right.
were looking at literary theory. I was teaching them literary theory. They knew these books inside out. So we could use those books. And do I enjoy those books? No, I think they're absolutely terrible. Again, I'm not the target audience. Are they
Right.
good romances? Well, not really, but they're not bad romances. They hit all the tropes of romance.
Okay.
So if
Yeah.
we are evaluating them in terms of horror, Twilight is shitty horror. If we're
Right.
evaluating in terms of fantasy or science fiction, it's shitty science fiction, it's shitty fantasy. If we
Right.
evaluate it in terms of romance, Twilight isn't that bad. It's doing all the same things. The older man, the younger woman. Yeah, that's trope of romance. The love triangle with the strapping young lad who's slightly dirty and greasy and has dirt under his fingernails because
Right.
he's the poor gardener type, Lady Chatterley's lover. You know, that's basically Jacob because he's from the wrong side of the tracks. Like we haven't heard that a million times before in romance. And then
Right.
there's the young rich boy who has the affluent family and he's from the right side of the tracks because we haven't seen that in romance before. It's doing romance. It's the
Right.
beautiful young girl that these two men basically fight over.
Right.
You know, all of this is romance. Is that bad because it's using the formula? No, it sold incredibly well. It was very, very popular,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
lots of people enjoyed it. So now we need to talk about why do we read? What's the purpose of reading?
Right. So, well, obviously, Twilight, Hunger Games, these books struck a chord in an awful lot of people. And yeah, probably, I mean, I'm sure people of all ages have read those books. But yeah, the target audience is probably a slightly younger demographic than you and I. But and they are both. I have not read them, but I'm assuming and you have read them, and you described them as pretty tropey, I guess, is one way to put it. But those people who are reading them, obviously, they're getting something from that experience. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it, and they are being entertained. They are escaping. They are probably identifying with the characters. I don't know how well done the characters are in those books, but I assume that people reading those books are identifying with some of the characters and going along those journeys and feeling the danger of them and the thrill and all of that. So isn't that also what we're doing when we read, you know, the Odyssey, or when we read Beowulf, or Canterbury Tales, or, you know, anything really. So they're performing an important function that stories do, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, and you know, there are two words there that you use that I'd like to unpack the way that we academics like to unpack things as if it's bloody luggage. And one is entertainment and the other is escapism. So let's start with escapism. Why
Yeah.
is literature and escapism bad? Because people say, oh, it's just escapism. You know who needs to escape? Prisoners. Is this world not dreary and mundane and boring enough and horrible enough with enough shit going on that we now say that, oh, you have to read very serious fiction about a hairdresser living in Croydon whose husband beats her? You go, you know what? Sometimes I want to read a story about magic and things being different and explosions and adventure. What is wrong with getting away from a dreary, mundane reality?
Exactly. And
Literature has always given us that release because you didn't have people listening to the Epic of Gilgamesh going, well, yeah, you know, I totally identify with King Gilgamesh. His life's just like mine. This is an accurate reflection of how we live. No,
yeah,
they're listening to the story of Gilgamesh going, wouldn't it be bloody awesome if we were King Gilgamesh? Because then we could do these things. They listen to the story of the Odyssey going, wouldn't it be great if we were King of Ithaca?
yeah,
They're listening to the story of the Trojan War and going, I wish I was as strong as Achilles, or I as noble as Hector, as smart as Odysseus.
yeah,
This is aspirational. It is escaping. It is enjoying something.
yeah.
And so escaping literature that gives you an escape. That is not bad. That is what literature does by
Right.
default. That is its raison d'etre. To,
Exactly.
to provide a different view as opposed to reading a biography of your own life.
Exactly. Yeah. One of my viewers left a really great comment on the video. It's essentially a quote from a C.S. Lewis essay where Lewis was reporting what Tolkien, his fellow Inkling, said. And you reminded me of that very much. And I won't have the quote exactly, but it's on there and you can probably find the Lewis essay as well. But essentially what Tolkien said is he posed the question, well, what sort of people are interested in not allowing other people to escape? And then his own answer was jailers. And when I think of jailers, I also unfortunately think of gatekeepers, and once again think of academics on some level. So yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. The other word, though, entertainment.
Entertainment. And one of the difficulties I think I have in communicating with other readers, we talk about entertainment, but when we use a term like entertainment, it doesn't have a fixed meaning. It doesn't have a set of criteria. Entertainment means something that engaged you, that you were enthralled with. And so you and I may be entertained by a type of writing, a writing style, or the use of something in the text. And someone else is going, yes, but I'm entertained when the warrior hit that guy in the head with an axe. And someone else saying, but I was entertained when there was the love story. That we all achieve, and we all have different types of things that we engage with that we find entertaining. It's not just passively being, oh, I'm just being entertained. Entertainment is a very nebulous term. And what really we're talking about is generating interest, generating engagement, generating enjoyment. Like, did you find it fulfilling? But also, some of the books that we read are emotionally devastating, that we read them and they rip our hearts out. They are tragedies. They are things that we are confronted by, things that disturb us, things, points of view, tragic events, horrific events, things that make us reconsider the world around us. And you go, well, how can you be entertained by that? And it's because entertainment here isn't meaning I'm sitting going, that's great when all of those people were tortured to death. I'm looking at it because I am so immersed in this. I cannot look away. It is engaging me on a level that I'm having a visceral reaction to it, or an emotional reaction to it, or an intellectual reaction. That is what can mean entertaining to me. And some of those things can be, we can have an emotional cathartic release. It can be a way of addressing some of the horrors of the human condition. And, you know, we still talk about it like, well, this book was really good. I was really, and you go, do we mean entertaining? And we fudge around this. Instead of going, entertaining is a useless word because it doesn't actually describe anything. It's just a general sense that you liked something. And talk about what it is that the book is actually doing. And, you know, we've had this in our discussions of some of the Malazan work.
Absolutely.
There are some really emotionally disturbing scenes there. There are things that deeply affected you, deeply affected me. And if we describe them as entertaining, there's a cognitive dissonance there, because you go, how did you find that really disturbing scene entertaining? And you go, because we're not talking about entertainment as in, haha, this is fun. It's about that engagement. And this, I think, is an issue that, yes, some books are like, look at some of the franchise movies, like the Fast and the Furious franchise. No one goes into that thinking there's going to be some deep revelation about the human condition. Family is all important, is about as deep as it gets. And it's not necessarily about the family you're born into. It can be about found family. There you go. And then it's cars revving and racing and doing stunts that get more and more ludicrous and silly and over the top as time goes on. Is it entertaining? For some people, yeah, because it, to be honest, it's mind. You're watching it and it's chewing gum for the eyes, and things explode, and it's exciting, and there's adrenaline, and yeah, fine. That's great. That's one type of entertainment. Then you can
Right.
watch, Citizen Kane and go, were you entertained by Citizen Kane? You go, dear God, it's a great movie. Or you could watch The English Patient or The Shape of Water, or you could watch The Shawshank Redemption, or you could watch Schindler's List, or you
Right.
could watch the latest Marvel movie, or you could watch Home, an animated film about a cuddly alien that goes on an adventure with a young girl to find her mum. You know, it all of these things have different audiences, are creating different reactions, and when you strip them down, tend to talk to one element of the human condition at least and
Right.
resonate with us.
Yeah. Yeah. So one concern I have is that we're digging our own graves in academia because we are ensuring the irrelevance of the very works of literature that we are claiming to champion when we say that they are somehow different from everything else. When they say these are worthy of study, you should read them because they're good for you, and these are garbage because they're mere entertainment. I think we're doing ourselves a big disservice. We're basically preparing our own noose there when we do that. And let's be honest, the humanities are in big trouble. They're in big trouble these days, unfortunately. And I think we can agree that reading is important, critical analysis is important, history is important, philosophy is important. All these things are important. They're in trouble in the higher education in a lot of places right now. So it's a shame that we are painting ourselves into this tiny corner, or staying in our ivory towers, our make-believe ivory towers, because
If people knew what academic salaries were, they'd go, so when you say ivory tower, you mean a
yeah,
small basement cell that's kind of damp.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I think we're doing ourselves in here when we are insisting that these are somehow qualitatively different. These are somehow a different species. Yeah, I know that there are some stories that are conducive to critical exploration and analysis. And that's true, by the way, in every genre or type of fiction that you can name. And then there are some that you'd have to stretch a bit maybe to do a critical exploration, but that doesn't mean they're useless, and that doesn't mean that they don't fulfill some of the fun. Look, it's a story. Stories, there's an array of functions that they have. So when we deny that great literature entertains and that it provides escape, I think we're shooting ourselves in the feet. I really do.
I also think that there's something of a misunderstanding between what it is literary academics do and teach and what
Yeah.
the general public or other people think that we do. So
Right.
let's say we have a Shakespeare course and it's just Shakespeare. And they
Right.
go, oh, so you're just teaching Shakespeare. And you go, no, we're using Shakespeare to teach critical thinking skills, to teach critical analysis, to teach
Right.
abstract thinking, to teach the ability to form argument, composition, and rhetoric. All of those skills. We use Shakespeare to do it. And yes, there is an element of learning about Shakespeare and learning about the plays. But the key skills that are taught in literature, in history, in the arts and humanities is
Yeah.
the ability to think critically, to think imaginatively, to think abstractly.
Yes.
That is the thing that we teach. But because we are so often under attack about, well, what are you going to do with your English degree? Are you just going to teach? As if A, that is a bad thing, and it is not. But B, that we feel that we need to defend that.
Yeah.
And what I think if more business leaders and more people who worked in various industries realized was you can take someone who has an arts and humanities degree and you bring them into your company and you train them to do the job. And you go, well, why would I do that? Why would I bother training them? You go, because you do that with every employee. Any employee you bring in, you have to teach your system of doing things. What a literature degree teaches a student, or a history degree, or any of those types of degrees, it teaches students how to learn and how to think and how to adapt.
Yep.
And so they can come in and learn that job.
Number one thing asked for, survey after survey of employers who are asked, what do you want most in your employees? The number one thing always across the board, critical thinking, the ability to think. And as you say, they can teach them everything else, but if you haven't learned how to think, you're at a disadvantage. So this is the thing that employers say they want. And that's our business. That's what we do in the humanities. Yeah. Yeah.
And as someone who has both a law degree and an English degree, both at undergrad, I have 2 separate undergraduate degrees. They weren't done at the same time. I can definitively tell you that in the law degree, the techniques, the things that you learn, all of that is exactly the same as the stuff that you learn in English literature. The only difference is there is a fact set, a data set that is slightly different, because you learn about laws, you memorize certain laws. But if you study law in England, you can't practice in Scotland or Northern Ireland. They are different legal jurisdictions that have different laws, so you have to retrain. So your law degree is not about teaching you the law, it's about teaching you the process of thinking about the law, about understanding where it comes from, about understanding how to apply it, how to argue it the right way, how things function. And then when you get to a different legal jurisdiction, you just learn the new data set. Literature is exactly the same. You take someone who you've taught 18th century literature to and put them in a 19th century literature class, and they'll go, yeah, well, I just read this and I apply the same stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's almost like the subject that you teach is less relevant than the skills that are accumulated through you teaching that. Yeah. And this is another aspect of what literature does. All literature teaches you, whether you want to or not, whether you engage with it or not, it teaches you to think about things from a perspective that is not your own. And we talk about this in tree-hugging hippie terms of empathy and compassion when we talk about the Malazan Book of the Fallen. But in essence, what literature does is it teaches you to think outside of yourself.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely crucial for so many aspects of life. Because if you can imagine someone else's position, if you want to argue with them, imagine how they are going to argue back. Construct your counter argument before they've had a chance to argue so you can demolish them. If you can imagine what someone else is going to want in a trade agreement, then you construct your counter offer knowing that they're going to ask for that thing, and you have the whole backwards and forwards. Being able to think outside of your own little box is absolutely essential in business, in finance, in law, in all of these different arenas.
Yeah, I would also add that it's essential for you, I think, to become a decent human being. And it's probably essential for, come on, we got to do the hippie stuff here. It's also essential, I think, for enough of us to learn to do it for the survival of our species. So I really do. I think it's important. I'm not, that's not even being hippie. I think that that's a very practical consideration. But I would also add that you mentioned your 2 bachelor's degrees, but you also have a PhD in fantasy literature.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of the fake here, actually. I have a PhD in medieval literature. I just wing it when we do these fantasy talks.
But of the two of us, who has the more respectable degree?
I think they're equal. They're equal.
No. I'm not asking what you think. I'm like, of the two of us, who has the more respectable degree?
Well, I think, okay, so you know that I don't feel this way because I believe that what you have studied is every bit as important as what I study. And I have a YouTube channel about what you studied. because I love it. And I think it's as important as what my PhD is in, which is fantasy. So, but yes, okay, I get your point. I think that a majority of people would regard the one in medieval literature as more respectable. Yeah.
Yeah. And
you're the one with the fantasy. You're the one who's, I mean, of course, I'm Dr. Fantasy, but that's for obvious reasons, I think, right?
But, and this is the thing. I mean, I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah.
But this is the attitude, because my PhD, now, if I was trying to dress it up and make it sound more academic-y and more respectable, it's in comparative literature using a narratological and structural approach in the commodification and genreification of narrative type.
Right.
And you go, yeah, you know, I can dress it up that way, but essentially I have a PhD in fantasy literature, and that is less respectable than a PhD in medieval literature, because fantasy.
You know, we medievalists are you know, at the top of society. So yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, we're talking about incrementally slightly better at the bottom of all of the different PhD. I told that story about like the people I was at university with. What are you studying? Oh, I'm doing my PhD in curing cancer. I'm doing my PhD in curing HIV and AIDS and AIDS treatments. What are you doing? I'm studying dragons. Like, people do PhDs and DPhils in all sorts of subjects that are very, very serious and very worthwhile. And mine was viewed as frivolous. But I had to do a study of something. Yeah. You add to something. And I was studying a field that I thought I had something genuinely new and original to say about how the field had been formed, about the understanding of the field. Yeah. And you go, well, that's perfect for what you want to do your PhD in, because a PhD is essentially to show that you have the ability to research on your own, to write an extended analysis and research paper, to do all of these things, that you fulfilled all of these criteria. It's the thesis at the end. It's not necessarily irrelevant, but it's a piece of evidence in that, yes, you have gone through the academic trials, you have passed through these things, and we have now baptized the doctor. You know, you go through your viva, you get cross-examined in person, live, by experts, and you have to know your stuff. And it's to ensure that you have the ability to do this kind of thing. But medieval literature will be more respected than fantasy because it has a history, it has a weight to it, it has a cultural resonance.
Well, we're going back to where we started with the whole canon thing too, aren't we? I mean, we're talking about this because you know, there was a time when studying medieval literature a couple hundred years ago would have been just an oddity, you know. So
look at Tolkien.
Look at him. I mean, he's a great example for many reasons. I mean, Tolkien is more than any individual responsible for the serious study of Beowulf as a piece of literature, because prior to his famous essay, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, you know, you had archaeologists taking Beowulf apart for looking for evidence of, you know, pagan funerals and that sort of thing. And you had linguists looking at it, but nobody really thought it was very good as a piece of literature. Tolkien changed that with his essay. That essay was really a big moment in Beowulf criticism. So yeah, but you know, his job, my job, you know, didn't exist 100 years prior to his own time. And English, as we talked about earlier, is a relatively recent discipline. It grew out of linguistics in many ways, the study of linguistics. Yeah, it's an interesting history, but it's just interesting when we step back from it all and you kind of realize you step outside of that all and you understand we've created these categories. We've created these categories of, and with these labels of what's worthy of study and what's not. And there are lines in the real world, right? There are no lines. These things blur into each other. You could put Neil Gaiman's American Gods right next to Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. And I promise you, there's really not a big difference in terms of incorporation of themes, incorporation of magical realism, incorporation of character development. I mean, they're both funny They're both serious at the same time. Yet one is fantasy and the other is magic realism.
But let's think about one of the great stories of England. It is English literature after all that we're talking about. So let's think about one of the great stories, King Arthur.
Yeah. Okay.
So all of the Welsh myths that they ripped off, and the various incarnations and rewrites and amalgamations and changes made, all the way up to Mallory. And you've gone through, I don't know, what is it, about 7 different iterations of various Arthurian tales, like Credit to Trois and the Matter of Britain and all of this stuff. But you get up to Mallory and you get Arthurian romance, and you get this fake chivalry stuff added into it. But it's a guy with a magic sword, a druid wizard, Gawain and the Green Knight. The Green Man, and he chop his head off and he's still alive, and spirits. Okay, so that's worthy of study because it's survived. Well, honestly, I can't go 500 years into the future, find out what survived, then come back and go, we should study this now. Well, that author's alive, because in 500 years, it's still going to be around. And again, we come back to this thing. Realism is a silly way to define literature.
Yes.
And we can talk about, okay, if you look at Dickens and you go, oh yes, but his Bleak House, very Victorian realist fiction, and you go, but that setting now is entirely fantastic because that version of London does not exist. And in fact, when Dickens wrote it, it didn't exist then either. It was a variant, a version. It was mimesis. It was a simulacra or a simulation of a version or variant of London.
There's a lot of hyperbole in it. A lot of hyperbole. Yeah.
And so it was a fictional setting. It wasn't a real setting. And his characters, let's not kid ourselves about Charles Dickens. His characters, a lot of them are caricatures. They're funny. They're exaggerated. They're not psychologically real people. And you go, but so why do we study Dickens? Oh, well, he was a great, he was a populist. He wrote popular fiction, exactly the same as the genres you're now denigrating and saying, oh, well, that's just science fiction.
Right.
Look at N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth.
Yeah, brilliant trilogy.
Look at Nnedi Okorafor's, like her work. And African futurism that she does. You look at the stuff done. Even look at the Expanse TV show, right? And so we're going outside of literature. We're talking about something that is clearly science fiction, that is in a different medium, and it's a TV show. But look what they did with the representation of how the ships move, their trajectories, how they orient themselves with, they accelerate and then flip. So the rockets are facing the other way so they can decelerate. They added an element to science fiction that had been missing before. But then you compare it to the silliness of Star Trek: The Next Generation. And you go, but at heart, so many of those stories were morality plays, like the Greeks did.
Yeah, gee, how about that? Yeah, I mean, you lost me a little because I don't watch television because I'm locked in my ivory tower. But
oh yeah, you don't get reception in the ivory tower. I got kicked out of the ivory tower, and I live in a trailer. But this is why I get so annoyed at these mealy-mouthed defenses or apologies for fantasy, and you go, they are mealy-mouthed because it is not a defense of the genre. It is not a defense of speculative fiction. It is a half-hearted little defense of their little tiny corner. And academics are so guilty of this. When we talk about literature, and even within fantasy literature, we talk about exceptional texts. And so many academics, and there has been a change, it is working in as a change now, but they talked about Dragonlance and The Forgotten Realms as extruded fantasy product. And quite frankly, go fuck yourselves. Because if people cannot realize the importance of these narratives in how they shaped public consciousness, how they shaped narrative structures, how they shaped computer games and role-playing games, how they have had such an enormous impact on modern society, on modern narrative, on modern storytelling. If these academics are so narrow-minded and blinkered that they cannot see that, you have no business calling yourself a literary academic who's meant to be able to see these things.
AP, I would pay money to hear you deliver that, what you just said, at a conference. In front of a crowd of academics. I suspect, though, a lot of them would agree with you, actually.
Well, and that's what I mean. There is a sea change now because newer academics coming through do not have the same narrow-minded opinions about what literature is or should be, because these are academics. If you think, you can have someone born in the year 2000 who is finishing their undergraduate degree.
Wow.
And to us, now, for some of our viewers, they're going, yeah, what's the big deal? And you go, to us, you're...
Yeah, trust me.
But think about how literature has changed in the last 21 years. And then think about, because when we talk about this big movement in fantasy, we're talking about the early 80s and 90s. The knock-on effect of that can be felt in the 2000s. And that has led to the rise of these authors in the 2010s and the 2020s. So this is a generational shift. And I think we will see more academics being open to what literature does. But I worry because academics defend their territory quite viciously.
Right. When the stakes are low, watch out.
And there's a reason why I'm not an academic anymore.
Which is sad to me. It is sad to me because you're talented and you would be obviously a very passionate and competent educator. So, and it's a shame that it is the way it is right now. And I like I said, the humanities are in danger. Keep fighting the good fight, I think.
I know, but this is why I dislike that mealy-mouthed exceptionalism, because it accepts the premise of the argument. It accepts that realism is the default. It is literature. It is the important thing. And you go, no, it's not. Don't accept that premise. And authors who do this, I can't blame them because they are trying to survive in the publishing world. They have to make a living. And you go, oh, Margaret Atwood sold all of these, but you go, no, but she, like every other author, has to make a living. And look at the number of authors now. We live in a golden age of literature. The choice that we have. If you go, you know what? I want a science fiction story about an octopus that really loves jelly. You put a post like that up online and someone will go, funny you should mention that. One of my favorite books happens to be about a giant space octopus that loves jelly. Here's the title. There are so many niche things now. And the disadvantage is it's getting harder and harder to find things. So we see, and you know, this is a criticism when people say, oh, I'm looking for this. And why do the same names keep coming up? And you go, well, you asked a very bland, generic question. Of course, people are going to recommend the same things. But, you know, we have so much literature now, so much accessible literature now. We have audiobooks, which allow people who either couldn't read before because for whatever reason, but also maybe don't have the literary skill, because literature used to be locked behind these gates of you needed a certain level of education in order to read. And now we have audiobooks which say, if you can listen to it, you can work it out from contextual clues, the same way that you do with conversation. And suddenly that barrier has been moved. We have books published online. We have ebooks where you can download the book. You no longer need the physical copy. that is in some ways another way of making smaller niche things that will never be successful enough for a publisher to go, yes, I'm going to print a whole load of these books and ship them out to the 5 supermarkets that will sell them.
Right.
Because there's only 5 supermarket chains or 5 book selling chains.
Right, right.
We now have the ability to sell smaller volumes of work, that they don't have to be the lowest common denominator anymore in order to sell vast quantities. They don't have to capture the fire that it just catches on for whatever reason. Because look at the Harry Potter books. Are the Harry Potter books in any way intrinsically better than a lot of the other children's fantasy that was around? No, but for some reason they caught on. Are they innovative and imaginative? You go, well, if you've read the Worst Witch series of books, a lot of what happens in Harry Potter happened in those. You know, so it's not imaginative in that way. In fact, there was even a TV show before Harry Potter came out called The Worst Witch, based on those books. There was the Books of Magic by Neil Gaiman. You had Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea. You know,
with the Magic School,
But that was not why they caught on. Well, but for some reason they caught on, and you go, that's brilliant. It got kids reading. I want more kids to read. Ideally, I would like them to read more books rather than just rereading rereading Harry Potter. But you know, and we live in an era with all of these books.
Yeah.
And the gatekeepers aren't as powerful anymore.
Right. And they know it.
So when I hear authors making these arguments, I am absolutely infuriated.
Yeah. But let's end on that note of hope, because you said a couple good things there that I have to agree with. One, being this idea of younger academics coming in and being a little more open-minded about what they would consider teaching in a course, and expanding. We have seen, even in I think most places, we've seen an expansion of what we're teaching in terms of who's getting represented. And that's a wonderful thing. That's a great thing. And hopefully that will extend to a lot of what's called genre fiction now, but because there's some great stuff there. The other thing that you said that I have to agree with is this golden age that we're in now in terms of talk about diversity. Wow. I mean, fantasy is ready to just explode with all kinds of great new takes on the genre. And that is a wonderful thing. That is just a beautiful thing. So there's a lot to be hopeful about, I think, that we can focus on here at the end of it, perhaps.
And to end then on a very, what I think is a hopeful note, which is the breadth and depth of fantasy, running from, even if you want to use the most pejorative language of mere entertainment, running from the most superficially entertaining story to the depths and complexity of some of the most engaging, emotionally destroying, focused fantasy texts. That is the spectrum we are looking at within fantasy. And you have that within science fiction. You have that within horror. You have that within all of these things. And when we have that spectrum, when we have that, there is no need to go, oh, how can you like that series? That series is crap. Okay, so they like that series and you don't. You don't need to tear other things down to elevate the thing that you love. Salman Rushdie does not need to tear down fantasy to elevate magic realism. There is room for the fantastic in our lives, and I think it is essential to have that magic in our lives, to have that fantastic in our lives, because it adds color, it adds experience, it adds empathy, it helps us imagine the world as it could be. And who doesn't want creative thinking and creative solutions to our problems? The only way you learn to think creatively is to experience things that you wouldn't have thought of. So you start thinking abstractly. Yeah. And that's what we can do.
Beautifully said, AP. Yep.
So I did like your video.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
And that's why I said you were very kind and polite about this. And I think it's because as an academic who has studied fantasy, I probably have a bigger chip on my shoulder about this than you do.
Possibly.
You're much more even-handed in your discussion. But Rushdie is right. The fantastic should be treated seriously. It should be considered literature.
Yeah.
Rushdie is wrong in saying that magic realism is the serious form of fantasy and other fantasy isn't.
Right.
But thank you so much.
Bring on. Yeah, bring on those fireballs, AP.
But thank you so much for having this discussion with me and listening to me rant.
You know what? I had a fantastic time. So thank you.
And for all of you still watching, thank you for putting up with me this long. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.